Thank you. Good evening. I'll put my glasses on, otherwise you won't get anywhere with this one. I'm going to assume some knowledge of the bombardment at Timber and Scarborough, but this first slide is obviously a very famous. When you think about remember Scarborough, the bombardment of Scarborough is one of the cultural events one of the iconic events of the Great War. After the bombardment, of course, the propaganda angle was massive, wasn't it? And remember Scarborough becomes this really iconic moment. How many people did it push through? Perhaps if you were a recruit and you was thinking, shall I go down to the recruiting office? How many people, how many thousands of people might that have pushed through the door? We just don't know that, but I suspect it's quite a lot. And yet, when we talk about the bombardment of Scarborough 110 years ago this evening, everybody knows about the 18 people killed on land. But at the same time, concurrently, there was a minefield being laid off Cayton Bay. And this is the SMS Kolberg. So as the bombardment's taking place, have you got Von der Tann, etc., bombarding the town? The SMS Kolberg goes south, and just off of Cayton Bay, and she's 300 metres off Cayton Bay. So that's only, 3 football fields, isn't it, off the coast. It's very close in. She begins laying 100 mines. And she goes down to Griswold Bay, turns out towards a British defensive minefield and essentially plugs a gap. And this is an element of the bombardment that's perhaps overlooked. 10 years ago, we had that wonderful 100 years exhibition and commemorations in the town, which was tremendous, wasn't it? It was wonderful. And at the bottom of that, it showed it talked about some ships that had been sunk during the bombardment, and it sparked my interest. One of the ones was the Emulator. I live in Filey. And the Emulator disaster is quite well known there because it was a Scarborough drifter, but she was manned by Filey people. So it was a big disaster, and it's blamed on one of the Kolberg mines. But when I looked into the disaster of the Emulator, she's 21 miles off Flamborough Head. She's halfway to Dogger Bank. It's 6 years later. The chances of that being a Kolberg mine is probably fairly remote indeed. However, if you're a member of one of the families in Filey, and you're being told, well, the death of your son or dad or whatever is down to a German mine, that's probably easier to come to terms with. That if you actually thought that this might have been a British mine that's probably come off its mooring, which is probably more likely the case, and then it's a bit more difficult to deal with. The same with the 3 Scarborough trawlers, one of which is a Condor, gets sunk north of, I think it's at Clayton, isn't it? And again, they blame the Kolberg mines. Again, with onshore drift, and it's 6 years later, the chances are it's probably not that at all. However, it's easy to process for everybody if you say it's the common enemy, it's the German mine that did it. So anyways, we're back to the story in hand. If you can see this map at all, and we've got this little fancy, oh, look at that, fantastic. So the Kolberg comes to Cayton Bay, begins to lay a minefield. You can probably see a smaller dotted line that I'm following around now. That was supposed to be where the minefield was going to be laid, which is opposite Filey Brig and then out to sea. But the weather was so terrible that day that the Kolberg turned at Griswold Bay and made her way out to sea. And this is a British defensive minefield. So what they're trying to do is 2 things. They're trying to stop any Royal Navy forces coming up from the Humber or Harwich. The Harwich force is the most serious one. Now, the British did know the Germans were out because they had intelligence and they knew they were out. So a lot of British forces were already knocking around, including the Harwich force. So the Germans, well, they wouldn't have known that, obviously, but they had to be aware of everything. So they laid this minefield. So in case anybody comes north to try and interfere with the bombarding force, then they would run into these mines. But I think really what they were trying to do is interdict the coastal trade. There's an awful lot of coastal trade in Britain at that time. It's coming from a place like one of the powerhouses of Victorian Britain and Edwardian Britain by this time, the northeast of England. Heck of a lot of coal going from Newcastle to London and also to France, because very early in the war, the French coalfields fall to the German army. You think of the Battle of Loos, that's all the coalfields in Germany, in northern France. So Paris becomes uniquely reliant on northeastern coal, believe it or not. And Italy is a massive importer of British coal. In the First World War, Italy is on our side. Italy is part of the alliance. So it's a very important trade to try and interdict. You might think to yourself, and I'll just whiz off down a tangent now. You might think, why didn't they put it on the railways? Well, they did. because if you come into York Station from the south, there's a big, well, there was, it's been closed recently, a big marshalling yards there, and that was developed in 1916, Dringhouse's Yard, to deal with the extra coal traffic, because 50% gets transferred from the sea to the railways. But the railways are overrun. They're absolutely crammed with war work. But you've got to have 11 trains to replace one collier. So if you think about that, you can see the reasons why an awful lot of trade is still going up and down the coast. So there we are, that's the minefield that's laid. 100 mines are laid, and nobody really knows it's there for the time being. Now, Mick Child, some of you may have been down at the Maritime Heritage Centre where there's currently the exhibition on, and there's a 10-minute clip of myself on there and one or two others talking about the bombardment. And this is the minefield. And if you look at the, I'll try and bring this, there we go. That is the track of the Kohlberg. You can see the mines there. And quite clearly, unsurprisingly perhaps, the shipwrecks align beautifully with the minefield itself. So the mines are laid, but we had to work out exactly what's going on with this minefield. And believe it or not, until we started this project, this is taken down at the Sub-Aqua Club in September 2023. Nobody had sat down and tried to work out exactly how many ships have been sunk by this minefield. And that's for all sorts of reasons. I think it's overlooked because partly by late 14, early 15, the casualty lists are beginning to mount. The British public are becoming quite used to the idea of large-scale loss of life. So, and the fact that the ships are sunk over several months and over the horizon and often after dark kind of it hides what's going on. So nobody sat down and worked out exactly how many ships have been sunk. And it was quite difficult actually. We eventually got to 20 shipwrecks because we got those charts out that I showed you earlier, the ones from the Kohlberg chart. Then we looked at where some of the shipwrecks actually are, and that's when we began to rule out things like the emulator and things like the Condor, etc., etc. And we ruled a couple of ships in. So there's a Hanna, a Swedish ship that sunk quite late in early 1915, quite late in the minefields operation. And the first officer says, oh, we were sunk by a torpedo. I saw the torpedo. Well, it's 1:15 in the morning. He may well have seen a torpedo, he may well not have done. But the fact is, submarines at that time were quite an exciting thing. They were new technology. If you're going to be sunk by anything, you want it to be kind of sunk by a submarine almost, because it was a sexy technology. So there are lots and lots of people who think they're seeing torpedo tracks, they're seeing periscopes all over the place. Dr. Jan M. Witt from Germany, who came across for the centenary, he sent me the Kohlbergs, that chart. And Jan looked into the German operations of the U-boats, and there are no U-boats on the Yorkshire coast at that time. There's one that's allegedly involved with the Tanguston, which is the last ship to be sunk, but she's off St Abb's Head. That's Berwick, so she can't be in two places at once. She sinks a ship right up there on the same day. There is another U-boat that comes across to Flamborough Head, but she uses Flamborough Head as a way marker. She's basically going down towards the Dover Straits, and she doesn't fire a torpedo or anything until she's near East Anglia. So these ships are obviously part of the minefield, but at the time there are lots of reports. But it's understandable. People are in a very, very tense situation. You've been through a shipwreck, and when a newspaper reporter says to you what happened, well, you're going to get different stories, aren't you? So we eventually get to the fact that we've got 20 ships. It may go to 21 because there's another one that may be involved in this conversation, but because there's 5 missing shipwrecks, by the way. 15 have been found, there's 5 missing. It might be 6, but until these have been positively identified, our best guess is 20 ships. Once we got to the 20 ships, I was able then to find exactly the number of people who were killed, which is 135. It was 137 until a few days ago, but I found 2 people who have disappeared off one of the ships in North Africa, absconded and disappeared. So they're actually shown as being killed, but they're not. But there we go. So it's a movable feast, but we're very close with that 20 ships and 135 people, which when you think about that, that's 7 times more, probably 8 times more than killed on land. So it's quite something to think about in the streets of Scarborough. But again, the impact of the bombardment was such, and it was such a shocking event. you know, an attack on a defenceless seaside town, modern warfare, quite literally crashing into the houses and the streets of a well-known town as well. You think if you lived anywhere in Britain, you might know about the Scarborough Castle, you might know about the lighthouse, you might know about the Grand Hotel, and all these things are damaged in the bombardment, aren't they? So this is why it caused such a shock, and this is why I think that the recruiting campaign was so well known, and it did so well, we think. But anyways, so let's get on to what actually happens out there at sea. So this is the it's a problem with making cards, isn't it? I forgot to look at them for a while. This is the Elterwater. So this is at 6:13 p.m. or 18:13 if you're working 24-hour clocks on the evening of the bombardment. So the minefield has been laid. They know there's been a ship south because at Cayton Bay there's some Yorkshire troops guarding the waterworks down there. So they know something's been going on, but they're not sure what exactly. This is the SS Elterwater. She's a collier out of Newcastle heading down to London with coal, and she strikes a mine and goes down inside 3 minutes. She goes down so quickly that there's no chance at all for the crew to launch the lifeboats. They're told by the captain, David Gillan, to throw anything they can find overboard, and that's what they do. And David Gillan himself, the captain, is washed off the bridge of the ship. She goes down so quickly, and unfortunately, men are killed aboard her. The city of Newcastle, which is another collier, is directly abreast of the Elterwater. She stops and she picks up the men, so they're quite lucky, but quite a few go down on the ship. There's so much wreckage, it takes them 45 minutes to get some of the other sailors who are in the water into the lifeboats, by which time they're so numb they can barely help themselves. They're probably minutes from death. So you can see it's in the dark, it's cold, it's December, and it's quite a shocking event. As they're rescuing the people from the Elterwater, they see two other ships strike and sink with mines, which is the Princess Olga, which is from Glasgow, and the SS Varen, which is a Norwegian collier. So 3 ships immediately go down on that first day. And on the first day, 19 people are killed. So some people say 19 people killed on land, don't they? But it's 18, 19, whichever it is. So it's almost exactly the same figure as the number of people who are killed in the bombardment of Scarborough are killed in the first few hours of this minefield. It's an horrendous event, really. And then we get one of there is one, I'll get onto this later, about the ideas of how they commemorate. There's only 5 sailors, by the way, who have graves on land. 130 have no known grave but the sea. And one of the sailors who's buried on land is from the Elterwater. He dies on the deck of the city of Newcastle. An hour they try to resuscitate him, but unfortunately the poor chap dies, and he's taken back to where he's from, which is South Shields, and buried there. And we'll get to that story in a short while. So people know there's now a minefield there. The shipping is stopped. All the shipping is stopped at the Humber, and all the shipping is stopped at the Tyne. Trawling is banned. The only vessels that are allowed out of Scarborough are cobbles. Nothing else. So that's a massive interdiction of trade. I've called this a Battle of Cayton Bay. It's not a battle that you might think between ships. I've just decided to make this up off my own bat. It's a 2-day battle between minesweepers and the minefield, and it's quite a dramatic story, actually. So just rolling back a little bit, mines are not new. Mines have been around for hundreds of years. The Chinese use mines. It's when industry begins to produce weapons that minefields become a real thing. So the American Civil War, in particular the Japanese-Russian War of 1904, that's when an awful lot of mines are used. The Japanese use them very effectively, and the Royal Navy sit up and take note that a supposedly weaker nation defeats another nation partly by the use of mines, particularly at Port Arthur in the Pacific. So in 1907, Charles Beresford of the Admiralty goes to Grimsby, and whilst he's at Grimsby, he notices new steam trawlers. He notices men with particular skills at using hawsers, at using donkey engines and what have you. So he realised it's a really good fit, that these people could be excellent for minesweeping. So by the start of the war, 140 minesweepers are ready for use. These are trawlers, and their crews sign up. So it's essentially civilian trawlermen working on behalf of the Royal Navy almost. There is usually one Royal Navy officer in charge of 4 minesweepers, and he'll oversee the whole thing. And they come north from Grimsby to take care of this minefield, and it's quite a dramatic carry-on over 2 days. Several minesweepers are sunk, lots of damage quite badly, and the first one that's sunk is the Oriander. She's a Grimsby trawler. She strikes a mine. Unfortunately, one of the young 18-year-old lads goes below deck seconds before she's hit. She goes down with him. The rest of the crew gets off, but she goes down so quickly, and she goes down about a minute, that people are just throwing themselves over the side, but there's lots and lots of other minesweepers nearby, so they get picked up quite quickly. But unfortunately, the first Royal Navy personnel dies during this event. There's a fellow called Lieutenant Boothby, who was a fisheries protection officer on this coast before the war. Immediately before the war, he oversees the Grand Central Railway's shipping out of Immingham. So he's quite a well-known character. He's the Royal Navy officer in charge of the 4 ships. He gets injured and he ends up walking with a stick, but he's back on a minesweeper in 48 hours. But the one thing he's quite annoyed about, apparently, he's got this really valued record collection. So he's got a gramophone and a load of 78 records on board the Oriander. And those records and that gramophone are at the bottom of the North Sea to this day. So you look from the Scarborough Subgraphic Club, if you happen to find a 78 record, don't be too surprised, because it's from the Oriander. So 10 minutes after the Oriander's sunk, this is a very well-known photograph of the passing. She's one of the most modern trawlers in Britain. She's got lots of subdivisions and she's big. But she hits a mine off of Cayton Bay, and you can see the hole, hopefully, that is punched in her. It said that you could ride a horse and cart through it, and I think you probably could, couldn't you, looking at that photograph. This, by the way, is a postcard. There are lots and lots of postcards produced of the wrecks because it sells. You've got to remember, people think about the bombardment as people fleeing from Scarborough. There's talks about people getting as far as Seymour Station and jumping on any train going towards York, and that does happen. But within a day or two of the bombardment, Scarborough's hotels are at the busiest they've ever been, apparently, in December, because everybody wants to come and look at the damage. And, of course, people being people, young kids are flogging people, bits of metal, saying, look at this shell, sir, would you like to buy this for 2 shillings? And, of course, people begin to produce postcards, and this is one of the postcards that's been given to me thanks for the Scarborough Museums, and it's a wonderful photograph of the passing. Nobody's killed on the passing, by the way. She's very lucky. She's towed stern first by the paddle steamer Brighton Queen into Scarborough Harbour. They beach her, patch her up and send her back to Grimsby, where she's properly repaired. By the way, in between the wars, she's sold to a French company and she becomes the Pacifique, and she's lost with all hands in 1928 off of Newfoundland, so a tragic tale, unfortunately. And here's some of the people who were killed. I said there's 5 sailors who have graves on land, and one of them is here. This is Alfred Chappell, who's a Grimsby trawlerman who joins up to be a trawlerman, and eventually he's killed. His body's recovered, so he's taken back to Cleethorpes by train and buried. And apparently he's given a full military funeral, which apparently his shipmates thought was hilarious, because he was a revolutionary socialist who hated war. And he joined the minesweepers because he didn't want to join anything that would kill another man. So he joined the minesweepers because he thought it would be saving life. And then, unfortunately, he was killed at Cayton Bay. And that's Lieutenant Hubert Boothby, of the Oriander. He's sunk again later on, by the way. We'll get to him very shortly. He's sunk twice. So I'll get to him now. He ends up with a cane, and then within 48 hours, they say, you need to get back out there. We're short of experienced skippers. So he's limping along and gets back on a minesweeper, and he's sunk within 48 hours again. He gets thrown against the wheelhouse roof, gets knocked unconscious. Luckily, the cook sticks a life jacket around his neck and throws him over the side, and he wakes up in the middle of the North Sea. But for his leadership, he's given a DSO by the King at Buckingham Palace, and that's a picture of Lieutenant. I watched too many American films. Lieutenant Boothby. Sorry, forgive me. Now, a minefield doesn't care what ship you are. It's not looking at the flag you're flying. So there are lots and lots of neutral ships get caught up in this minefield. This is the Boston, Despite her name, she's a Norwegian ship. And she strikes 2 mines off of Cayton Bay. And she's full of wood. She's full of wood pulp, balsa wood and general wood. She's mainly for the newspaper industry in London. And guess what? She doesn't sink initially. But the crew abandon ship quite quickly because rails have hit 2 mines. Half the crew get picked up by the Scarborough lifeboat, the other half get picked up by the Filey lifeboat, and she runs aground, and that's Filey Brig. And of course, probably within minutes of running aground, there's people taking photographs and selling postcards, and there's another postcard that you could purchase of the Boston. It's quite a dramatic view, isn't it? And when she's on there, she breaks her back. So they initially thought they could float her back off and sort her out, but she breaks her back. So they break her up on Filey Brig. There's a spy scare in Filey as well, because there's a gentleman seen walking around the town with a pair of field glasses and asking lots and lots of questions about the bay. So the police apprehend him and find a revolver as well. So they think, oh, here was a spy. He's from Leeds. Apparently, I don't know why he's carrying a revolver. It's never explained why he's got a revolver in his pocket. Anyways, but apparently he had the glasses so he could look at the wreck. And he was going to an auction of all the bits and pieces off the ship, which happens at one of the smokehouses in Filey. And it's an interesting, I've got the Norwegian Maritime Museum sent me a copy of the auction catalogue, and it's fantastic. Because of course on there's ropes, there's lamps, there's lifeboats, all the stuff you'd expect to see. But then there's a bucket of soft soap, which is sold, by the way. 19 boxes of fish balls, but they are Scandinavian, so I suppose that's why. And a pram. Why is a pram on a ship? I've no idea. But anyway, I think one of the crews evidently had a young child and bought the pram, stuck it on the ship and thought, when we get back home, we'll sort it all out. The pram's sold off. I don't know why he doesn't take the pram back, but anyway, he doesn't. The crew themselves end up back, they go to Newcastle by train and eventually end up back in Norway. Norway being a neutral nation, of course, during World War I. So quite a dramatic event, and these postcards sell quite a lot, apparently, and lots of people come to Filey to look at this dramatic event. But here's the SS Leersum. So she's another neutral. She's a Dutch ship. This is quite a terrible story, actually. I mean, there's lots of terrible stories, clearly, but this is a really bad one. So the Leersum comes out of Rotterdam. Holland's neutral. On board the ship is a 16-year-old Belgian kid. His parents are killed when the Germans invade Belgium in 1914, so he flees into Holland, ends up in Rotterdam and joins a ship, the Leersum. This is his first voyage. Unfortunately, the Leersum strikes a mine. There's one of the Dutch stokers is killed immediately, and the ship begins to sink very, very quickly indeed. But they manage to get a boat away. Whilst the crew are sat in the boat, the 16-year-old Belgian lad appears on deck. And there's ropes hanging over the side, so they're telling him to jump, but he won't have it. He's terrified. The ship goes down. He's still clinging onto the rail. He's lost. What an awful story, you know. And he's not commemorated. I'll get onto the commemorations in a bit, but he's not commemorated anywhere. I found his name, and I can't find his first name at all. It might be Henry, but I'm not quite sure. What an awful story. So again, the minefield really doesn't care what exactly your ship is at all. Let's start putting these over here, or I'll get confused as usual. Okay. So there are lots and lots of ships, and I could spend hours and hours talking about each ship, so I don't want to do that, otherwise we'll be here for, it'll just turn into a litany of this ship hit this mine and sank. And they've all got the great stories, and they've all got some really dramatic stories. This is the SS Tangiston. She's one of the last ships to be sunk in the minefield, and it's a really, really interesting story because the Tangiston is a iron ore ship. She's got a Swansea flag on the back of her, but she comes out of North Africa, and she's got 6,000 tons of iron ore on board, and she's heading for Middlesbrough. They slow down in the night because they're too early for the tide on the Tees, and they strike a mine at 9:30 off of Cayton Bay. She goes down in seconds. She's got 6,000 tons of iron ore on board, so she's not hanging around, and all but one of the crew die. The only chap who survives, and here he is, the luck of the Irish, an Irishman called James O'Toole. And apparently he gets off, he's in his bunk, but he gets up on the deck and just jumps over the side. And he finds a piece of wreckage and stands on it. As the ship's going down, he's got lots of the crew, and we'll get to these in a moment, are Arabians who are below decks, they're in the stokeholes, and he's asking them to get off. He's saying, jump, get on top of something, get out of the cold water, but they can't understand him. I mean, when you think about these chaps going through a tremendously a stressful situation, the second language might be English, it's dark, it's cold, and they stay in the water and die. Everybody, apart from James O'Toole, dies. James O'Toole stood on his little box bouncing around the middle of the North Sea in the middle of the night. Eventually, the steamer Woodville turns up and he shouts at her, and they spot him and they drag him up on the deck, and the first thing he says is, "Has anybody got a fag?" Which is an amusing story from a terrible thing. The Tanguston, by the way, just going back to her, this is one of the U-boat hoaxes almost, because a lot of people start saying she's been sunk by a U-boat. The U-12 is said to be the U-boat in question, but Dr. Jan M. Witt from Germany found that she was off St. Abb's Head on that day, and she sank the SS Abaddon the same day, so it's impossible that she could have sunk it. And I'm not quite sure where the stories come from anyway, because the only survivor was in his bunk as the ship went down, so he had no idea what had happened. He just heard an explosion. So that is that, unfortunately. An Indian sailor, and I say Indian sailor, and I'll get to all this about Indians and who's an Indian, who isn't, is found floating in wreckage off Flamborough Head the next day by a fishing cobble from Bridlington. He's taken on board the cobble, he's taken back to Bridlington. They make extensive efforts to try and work out who this chap is, but they can't. So he's buried at the moment in an unmarked grave in Bridlington Cemetery. And unfortunately, he's in with 4 other people, so we can't even put a headstone to him. But he's definitely an Arabian sailor. So the Tanguston takes on 18 Arabians at Aden in modern-day Yemen, and they signed up en masse. It should have been 20 odd, I think it's 21 initially, but 2 or 3 of them disappear, luckily, before the ship leaves North Africa. They decide enough's enough, we're out of here, it's too dangerous. And all these chaps are killed. But I know all their names because at the British Library in London, there's a compensation document, and it's that thick. And luckily it's survived. And in that document, the naval attaché, the British naval attaché at Aden, looks through all the records to see who's died on this ship and goes hunting for the relatives. Some of the relatives come to him because they deserve compensation. They are paid compensation, just like everybody else. But he's extensive. It's quite interesting because a lot of people talk about, they call them Lascar sailors. So I'll get into this now. They're members of the Indian Merchant Marine. However, to be in the Indian Merchant Marine, you can be from anywhere from the East African coast to Burma. This is a massive area. There are no Chinese sailors, by the way, involved in this minefield, but the Chinese sailors are basically the entire Pacific. That's how you are classed by the British Merchant Marine. That's where you're from. So these chaps are put down as being Indians, but they're not. They're from Arabia. They're from probably Yemen and modern-day Saudi Arabia. And quite extensive inquiries are made to try and find people's, and they do find some of them. It's quite a brutal thing, but it's the same for British sailors as anybody. Any child under the age of 14 gets compensation. As soon as they hit 14, that's it. Any wives get compensation, but if they remarry, that's it. And there's a boy sailor on board the Tanguston, and his uncle appears and says, well, he was looking after my family, he was sending money back. But they came to the conclusion that because he was on a boy's rate, he can't possibly be looking after the family, so they refused the claim. But it's an interesting story, isn't it? Because a lot of people think about Lascar. They call them Lascar sailors, by the way, which is a Portuguese name for native sailors. A lot of people, they were cheap. That's why they're there. It's an economic thing. They're cheap. And they were treated badly. There's no two ways about that. I think everybody accepts that nowadays. However, the flip side to the coin is they did try and pay compensation where they could pay it, which is it's another side of the story. The other side of the story is how they are all commemorated, but that's part of the next part of my talk. Let's get to... So, I mentioned 135 sailors. 5 sailors have graves on land. 130 sailors do not have any known grave. This is Julius Weathercock from the SS Glenmorvan. The SS Glenmorvan vanishes completely. She's out in Newcastle. She's a British ship. You might think Julius Weathercock, that doesn't sound very British. He isn't, he's Danish. But he's married to a local girl. He's living in North Shields. And he vanishes with the ship. And one of his great-grandchildren has emailed the Maritime Heritage Centre recently and said, if you do find the ship, please let us know, because we would love to know what happened to great-grandfather or grandfather. And this is one of the ships, and again, this is part of the research journey. The Glenmorvan initially is thought to have disappeared not off Scarborough, but off the Inner Dowsing, which is at Skegness. Because she leaves, what a lot of ships did whilst there was minefields around, they'd leave in pairs. So 2 colliers leave Newcastle together. The idea is if your ship gets sunk, at least you've got somebody else knocking around who can help you out. A lot of ships do this. So the Glenmorvan sails south from Newcastle. And in the captain says, the captain of the other ship, of the Joseph, I can't remember the other name, anyway, it doesn't matter. The other ship's captain says that he saw the Glenmorvan off the Inner Dowsing. Unfortunately, it's wrong, because the first mate has got his glasses on this ship, and he says to the captain, oh, that must be the Glenmorvan over there. And he's, oh, okay. So when they go to the inquiry, the captain says, oh, yeah, we saw her off of the Inner Dowsing. But then when the captain goes below deck, the first officer puts his glasses back on the ship, and she's got 3 masts. The Glenmorvan had 2. He realised she wasn't a collar at all. It wasn't the Glenmorvan. So actually, it does eventually come out. The last person to see the Glenmorvan is the first officer of this other ship. They've got engine problems, so they start to drop behind her about Whitby in the darkness. So it's getting dark. The Glenmorvan pulls away. She's doing about 3 or 4 knots more than the other ship, so he's the last person to see her. So the likelihood is that the Glenmorvan is off Scarborough, but until she's positively identified, we don't know. But we've brought her into the conversation because we think the likelihood is she is off Scarborough, because the facts kind of fit together. But anyway, that's a picture of Julius, which was sent to us by his great-granddaughter, I believe. So it'd be wonderful to find her one day, but it's quite difficult, as I'll get to in a moment. So who were these sailors? Here's a little pie graph here. Do you like a pie graph? These are not just the dead sailors, by the way. These are the sailors. You're able to, once you get into the British Newspaper Archive, and also down at Kew in London, there are all the crew lists. It's quite easy to reconstruct. Easy, when I say that. It's easy to reconstruct the crew list. So here are the crews of all these 20 ships. Now, 64, when I say British, by the way, this is 1914, so British in this context means Ireland as well. Similarly with Russia, Russia includes some of the Baltic states, because that's the geopolitical reality of the day. So 64% of the sailors, as you might expect, are British. And and I will do this in a couple of paragraphs' time, because there are more than one, most of them are northeasterners. Most of them are from somewhere between the Humber and Aberdeen. Then 17% are Indian, and I mentioned Indian. I hope you got the idea that these guys could be from anywhere from East Africa right across to Burma. So 17% are Indian, and then you've got the 10% of Scandinavians. Now, we've just seen Julius Wedderkopp, haven't we? There he is. There are lots and lots of Scandinavians living in Britain at this time, lots of Scandinavians. And something like 10% of the crews of all British merchant ships have got Scandinavians on board. And they're not living in Norway, they're living in North Shields, South Shields, Hull, Grimsby, wherever. And they generally are married to local girls. And I think partly Johansson becomes Johnson in time, doesn't it? Svensson becomes Stevenson in time. So it's partly one of these vanishing minorities, if you like. But if you go to Hull today, I went to a maritime history conference this summer down in Hull. You come out of Hull Paragon Station, turn left, and there's a Danish church. So there is still, it's still there, but it isn't there in some respects. So it's, Grimsby, by the way, the outbreak away in Grimsby, there are 600 Scandinavians working in trawlers. And I know the 600 because they weren't allowed to fish whilst the war was on initially, because they were seen as aliens. They weren't British. They couldn't be trusted. And the Grimsby Telegraph goes berserk about this and says, well, these guys have been here they've been here for decades. Most of them are married to British wives. Most of them have got British kids. Why can't they go on and serve on the minesweepers? Because a lot do want to do that. And they eventually give in, of course, and common sense prevails. But it's one of these interesting missing minorities. Of course, some of that 10% of Scandinavians are on Scandinavian flagships. We've just seen the Boston, haven't we, out of Bergen. So there are some Swedish ships as well that get caught up in this, and a Danish ship. 5% are Russian. Again, be careful with that terminology, because one of the guys involved in that is from Riga, which is not part of Russia today, but it was then. And then we've got the others. And the others are a bit more interesting than you might think. There's a Greek bloke. Well, okay, yeah, Greeks, big sailing nation. And there are lots of Swiss. I have no idea why Swiss people have ended up on ships. It's that well-known maritime nation, Switzerland. But I'm guessing that Switzerland, again, you've got to think about parts of Switzerland in 1914 were quite poor, mountainous regions. But if you've got, I guess if you worked on a steamer on one of the big lakes, you might have some transferable skills, but who knows? And then here's, let me go back actually. Right, what I wanted you to keep your eye on is the orange one, the one that says 17%, which is the Indians. And just watch how this jumps. So this is the sailors killed by nationality. Obviously, again, the majority are British, but suddenly, if you look at that jump, 29% are Indians. Well, why is that? Well, they're in engine rooms. The very worst place you could possibly be in the North Sea when you're sunk by anything. So mines and torpedoes are the two things that sink of most merchant ships in the North Sea during World War I. So the very worst place to be is the engine room, because even if it doesn't strike near the engine room, you've got high pressure steam pipes, you've got hot coals, and then of course you're below decks. And you're a second language. English might not be a first language. I don't know how well trained these chaps have been. You're stressed and you've got to get up and out. So guess what? You know, quite a lot of people who die in this minefield, the percentage jumps quite significantly. And there's the Scandinavians, Russians, etc. And there's, unfortunately, the Swiss as well. And I just wanted to move on to the British sailors, just give an idea of how local a story this is, even though there's nobody from Scarborough, by the way, at all killed in this minefield. There are lots and lots of Northeasterners and Yorkshire people involved in this minefield. So 62% of British sailors are from England. And if I did another graph, don't worry, there's no more pie graphs. If I did another pie graph, if you did the Humber to the Tyne, then that would be a massive percentage. You know, the vast majority are from either Grimsby, Hull, Newcastle, Sunderland, Middlesbrough, as you might imagine. 6% from Northern Ireland. A ship I've not mentioned because there isn't time to go for every single ship there is going here is the Gem, that a lot of people might know about. The Gem, she's a Glasgow steamer, but she's predominantly crewed by men from the Antrim coast. She goes down with all hands, she blows in half and disappears. And 10 years ago, the Sub-Aqua Club gave the binnacle to the people of Cushendall, I think is that how to pronounce it, I'm not quite sure. And it's in their lifeboat house to this day. So that was a terrible tragedy. So virtually all those 6% are from that one ship indeed. We saw James O'Toole, of course, didn't die in the sinking. Scotland, almost all the Scots, by the way, they're almost all of them from places like Aberdeen, Dundee, etc., etc. And you've got on there, you've also got the Isle of Man and Ayr. So to get onto the commemorations, and this is a really interesting part, the commemorations are a very fascinating bit. The British sailors, merchant sailors, are on if you look in the bottom left-hand corner, right-hand corner rather, as you're looking at it, the Tangiston. So that's British sailors. They're at the Tower Hill Memorial in London. Every British sailor and interesting European sailor, i.e. the Scandinavians on British ships, and one Japanese bloke apparently, are on that memorial. However, the Indian sailors, and again, remember the context of Indian, are in Bombay, and that's the place above it, the place with the green walls. That's the Bombay Sailors Memorial in modern-day Mumbai. So in death, the crew of the Tangiston have been pulled in half. Half of them are on this memorial in London, the other half are in Bombay itself. People have said, is this sweeping under the carpet the role of, and forgetting about the role of Imperial Commonwealth sailors? Possibly. If you want to be more kind, you could say that they're trying to remember sailors closer to their home ports. Somewhere in between the two, the truth probably lies. The structure in the other corner is an interesting one. This is Norway. So Norway's neutral, but Norway lists all their sailors lost in World War I, which is quite unusual because the Swedish don't. The Swedish, I think, look at their sailors and think, okay, it's just like being lost to the sea, isn't it? It's one of those things that happen. It's the price of having ships on the sea that these terrible tragedies occur. So they don't have anything. but the Norwegians do, and that's still there to this day. And I've managed to add 2 or 3 names to that, which I'm quite proud about. And they've been, by the way, the Norwegians have been absolutely fantastic. So that's commemorations. As I mentioned, oh, by the way, sorry, before I finish commemorations, the Danish have no commemorations at all. They have some interesting commemorations because the south of South Jutland was part of Germany till the Danish-Prussian War of 18 something or other, late 1800s. So there's a lot of people in south of Denmark who quite look at Germany as the mother nation, and they serve in the German army during World War I, quite big numbers, and quite a lot are killed. So they are remembered, and some sailors are also remembered, but I don't think that the Danish sailors and British ships are remembered. I've been trying to get in touch with them, but I've not had any joy thus far. The Swedish, none. The Dutch, none whatsoever. Again, it's just people lost to the sea. And the one Belgian chap clearly is not commemorated. And clearly in Scarborough, nothing's commemorated because these are events that take place within a mile sometimes of the shoreline, but there is nobody directly involved with the town of Scarborough who dies in this minefield. But there are burials, there's 5. This is John Lappin, who may be Swiss or maybe Russian, depending on who you'd listen to. And he's the chap who's killed on the Elterwater, the first ship. And he's taken back to South Shields where he's living, and he's buried in Harton Cemetery. And that is a brand new headstone, by the way. The Friends of Harton Cemetery did a bit of research before I got in touch with them, a long time before that, and they worked out where it was. And that's literally the last month. So they put this new headstone up to him, so that's fantastic. This is the Garmo, Thaddeus Gilbert. I think Thaddeus is the correct pronunciation, I might be wrong. He's off with one of the minesweepers. He's brought ashore at Scarborough, and he's buried up at Manor Road. He's given a full military cemetery, full military funeral rather, and taken back up there, and he's one of the few burials that we know about at Scarborough. But there is one other, and this is from the SS Torquay. Now, don't be fooled, because the Commonwealth War grave at the front is not his burial. If you look behind it, there's an empty plot, and that's where he's buried. And there is confusion about Carl Thayson or Pearson, because he serves as Carl Pearson, but he's actually called Carl Thayson. And I think it's Swedish, or it might be Norwegian, I can't remember without my notes. It might be, I think it's Swedish. Anyway, it doesn't matter. He's remembered on the Tower Hill Memorial in London, but he's buried here in Scarborough. So I think it got missed because of the 2 names. So we've discovered this, and we've passed it to Liz up at the Friends of the Cemetery, and we may or may not get, hopefully, a Commonwealth War Graves Commission headstone over his grave in the next few months. So fingers crossed for that one. So there are 2 here at Scarborough. The other one's at Bridlington. Again, don't be fooled by the Commonwealth War Grave Commission headstone. This burial's to the left of that headstone as we look at it. And I remember I told you about the Indian chap who's killed on the Tangiston and found by a cobble and brought ashore. That's where he's buried. And because he's in a grave with 4 other people who are also unidentified, not to do with the minefield, by the way, just other sailors. Apparently the Bridlington Cemetery will say that you can't put a headstone up without mentioning the other 4. So unfortunately, there he lies, thousands of miles from home, which is a real shame. And finally onto the wrecks. The wrecks have been known about for years, of course. Fishermen would have found wrecks almost immediately. You get your trawl stuck on a wreck, you know there's something down there. Fish find wrecks. Juvenile fish hide in wrecks to avoid predators. That's attracted to fishermen as well because there's more marine life. A great picture by Danny sat over there of the Garmo. She's quite close in, so it's a great photograph. If I can try and do this, that is the winch apparently, and here is the anchor. So yeah, it's a great photograph of the Garmo. So the wrecks are there. 15 are identified, 5 are not. They think they know where the other 5 are. Well, they know where other wrecks are, but it's identifying these wrecks, positively identifying, is a bit more difficult than you might imagine, apparently. So there we are. But lots of things have been picked up of these wrecks over the years. This is a starboard navigation lamp from the Varen, which sunk on the first day, of course, Norwegian ship, which is down at the Scarborough Sub Aqua Club. And there's the steering boss of the MC Holm, which is a Danish steamer, which is sunk in the middle of, early 1915. She goes into the minefield at full speed, apparently, which is, the captain got a bit of a telling off for that. No, luckily, nobody's killed. She's out at Savannah going to Copenhagen, and when she sinks very rapidly, she's got lots of cotton on board, bales of cotton, and they shoot 20, 30 feet into the sky, apparently, as the ship sinks. But luckily, there she is. And that's above the bar in the Aqua Club. So if you're ever down there, keep your eyes peeled for that one. And here's a side scan summary that Matt did of the Oriander. The Oriander, if you remember, if you can think back, one of the first, well, it's the first minesweeper sunk with records on board. And the front part is the front part's demolished. That's where she's at the mine. The bit you can really make out is the stern of the ship, or the vessel, sorry. And apparently, from what they've told me, that was a very useful piece of information to dive on her. So what's happening? Well, we've got an exhibition at the moment down at the Scarborough Maritime Heritage Centre. That's all until March. You've basically got some storyboards that I put together, and then there's a film that Mick Child from, I've not mentioned Mick, I'll mention in a moment, that did about the bombardment itself, mainly based on Hartlepool, but he did a little piece about Scarborough and really honed in on the wrecks, which is great. So that's down there till March this year, so please do bob down and have a look at that. We've got a series of daily articles going out there, so every time there's a ship sank, so there's 3 up there today, 3 ships are mentioned today, so it should be on the website at some point, but Mark's away on holiday at the moment. But anyway, I'll keep putting things on my website as well, it's on there. So every single day where there's a commemoration of a ship up until March, the full story of that ship will appear. I'm doing these similar talks at Filey on the 19th of Feb and then Bridlington on the 3rd of March, spreading the word a little bit. I'm hoping to get something published in the Society for Nautical Research's journal. I don't know where I'm going with this yet. I'll either do the Indian sailors and the compensation claims from the Tangiston, or the revolutionary socialist trawlermen on the Oriander. So I don't know where I'm going with that one yet. We may get the sailors' grave marked at Dean Road, as I just mentioned a moment ago. And then, of course, there's the 5 missing wrecks, which the guys and gals from the Aqua Club are going to look for the next 3 or 4 years. And fingers crossed, some of those will be found. What could have happened, because we put in for a bid with the Heritage Lottery, but unfortunately didn't get it. There could be a publication. I'm sat on 25,000 words, so I might chase pen and sword or something like that and see if they'll do that. We wanted to get national and international speakers. What's been fantastic about this project is so many people from all of the world have really, lent into this and helped us out. Dr. Jan M. Witt from Germany, the chaps who run the Minnehaula, which is the commemoration in Norway, have been fantastic, and as have all sorts of staff. So I thought we could bring them to Scarborough at some point. We'd like to scan some of the wrecks a little bit more. The Baby Killer film, that's the one about Hartlepool. Mick Child wanted to come and do a film of the wrecks, but again, this is subject to funding. I've just mentioned that. Remembrance of the sailors. Here's something we could discuss, I suppose, at some point. Should these sailors be remembered in Scarborough? Should there be something somewhere up at Oliver's Mount or down on West Pier? I don't know. Something up for debate, really. And lots of links have been developed with museums and historians across Europe, and I'm quite keen to keep that going. So that's the end of the talk. Very brief thank you. Well, it's not a very brief thank you, actually, is it? It's quite a long thank you. Thank you to the Scarborough Maritime Heritage Centre. They've been fantastic. They welcome me with open arms. They facilitated my week down in London, rooting around in the various archives. The Aqua Club, again, their discoveries they're making are just amazing. And it's great to give them a bit of context as well to these ships that they're diving on. The Scarborough Museums have been brilliant and given us all sorts of images to work with, and who knows where that might go in the future. The Friends of the Cemetery, Mick Child, I mentioned, Dr. Anthony Firth, who's great on the East Coast War Channels. I'd have more time, I'd have mentioned the East Coast War Channels, which are really interesting themselves. Dr. Jan M. Witt from Germany. And then you've got all the various maritime museums in Denmark, in Holland, in Norway, and Sweden. They've been absolutely brilliant. Couldn't have been better, and thank God they all speak fantastic English. It's wonderful. So that's my project. I know we're marching with time, aren't we? So I'm quite open to any questions, and I have really had to skim across the surface of this, and so there we go. Thank you.
Oh, I can stand up, yeah. That was just so interesting, but so very sad, wasn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
Should these sailors be remembered in Scarborough? I think they should. Mm. Right, has anybody got any questions? And Simon's going to put the mic to you. If you can just put your hand up.
Just very briefly, the mines laid by the Coalberg, were Were they free floating or tethered?
Tethered. And they were tethered on, the Germans were very good at mines, and they had a system where it would rise and fall with the tide. And one of the mines was picked up intact and examined by the British and improved our mines no end. And that mine is currently at the Imperial War Museum in Manchester. We wanted to get it across, but it's rather large.
Anybody else?
It looked on the map as though the line of mines was laid coming in very close to the shore. Is that right, and why so close?
Right, we'll find this. Give me a moment. Let's get there. There we are. Yeah, she was 300 metres out. Yeah, so the reasons are twofold. One is to interdict the Royal Navy ships, and the second is to get stuck into the coastal traffic. The coastal traffic early in the war was told to keep as close to the shore as possible because it's easy to defend. So the Germans sent a U-boat over 2 weeks before the bombardment and did a lot of scouting about, and this was part of it. They worked out where the shipping lane was. East Coast Wall Channels, I just mentioned those. The East Coast Wall Channel, by the time of the bombardment, it got as far as Bridlington. So the British worked out very early on that you can't sweep the entire North Sea, there's no point. And actually, some of the German minefields that get laid, they use as a defensive minefield. So they sweep a channel, and this channel is swept every day. It's patrolled, it's buoyed. Of course, once you do that, that becomes a target, but it's easy to defend a target. But it's only got to Flamborough Head by the time the bombardment occurs. And what happens after the bombardment and the minefield here really accelerates things. By Boxing Day, they've got as far as Scarborough, and then it moves on over the course of the next 6 months and goes all the way to the Orkneys. So it becomes this buoyed channel. And you think about, it's not just a channel that's offshore, it's also the Scarborough Wireless Station, for example. There is a watch station at Filey Brig, there's a watch station at Flamborough Head. So it's part of there's all sorts going on. There's airships by the end of the war, so there's an awful lot of going on. So it's a great question, yeah, but the ships were told to stay very close to the shore.
Anybody else?
I'll sneak one in. With the conflict laid 100 mines and claimed 20 ships,
Yeah.
that sounds extremely effective. Is that typical?
Yeah, apparently no, it's a very effective. It's been argued by some proper maritime historians, not like me, amateurs like me, that this is one of the most effective minefields of the First World War. Also, they've learned a lot of lessons from this because it was very early. This is one of the very earliest large-scale ones. There are other ones laid off Yarmouth, but this is the first big one, really big one. So they learn a lot of lessons about traffic control in particular, and then buoying the minefields and where to stop. So they learn a lot of lessons from it, and getting the German mine in particular, it really, we end up laying more mines than anybody else during the war, as it happens. And this is why when I talked about the other ships that get sunk and people say it's a Kohlberg mine, it's almost certainly a British mine, but it's just easier to tell people. We can't rule it out, of course, but I think the probability is it's a British mine. Well, if you've got any other questions, I'm off to Wetherspoons for a quick pint before I get the last train to Filey, so please do ask on.